in March 2014 as the Vice President for Vocation and Formation and as Assistant Professor of Practical Theology. He transitioned to Vice President and Chief of the Leadership Formation in 2017. He was ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA in 1993. He served as Senior Pastor of the San Clemente Presbyterian Church from 1997 to 2014. Prior to that, he served as Associate Pastor of Discipleship and Spiritual Formation at First Presbyterian Church of Hollywood. With a Master of Divinity and a PhD in Theology from Fuller Seminary, Tod has taught Master's and Doctor of Ministry classes since 2001. He has extensive experience in executive coaching, marketplace, church and nonprofit consulting, blogs on leadership formation, and is the author of 3 books. It Takes a Church to Raise a Christian, How the Community of God Transforms Lives, Showtime, Living Down Hypocrisy by Living Out Faith, and Canoeing the Mountains, Christian Leadership in Uncharted Territory. So please join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Tod Bolsinger.
Thank you. Good morning. It is very nice to be with all of you here. I just had this shudder when he said something about President of California. Oh my gosh, what a nightmare that would be. I'm just a seminary professor. I'm so thrilled to be with you all and to have this chance to step into your world. I loved that sermon this morning that Dr. Shelton gave us. That was about the most perfect tee-up for this space and place, time, our challenge, where we find ourselves. So my hope is that we'll understand how the notion of our being in a liminal space and being in a liminal mission come together in God's good timing. And so that's what we're spending our time together. I've spent the better part of the last 10 years running around the country basically quoting my favorite quote on leadership. Leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. It comes from Ronald Heifetz out of Harvard, and it's a really important quote to me because what it reminds us is that there's a difference between leadership and what we sometimes call management. If you look at the scriptures, there's not a lot actually on leadership. It's pretty hard to do a concordance search on leadership. But you can find the word stewardship. And stewardship and manager go together, especially a lot of in Jesus' parables. So one of the things to remember is that management is about taking care of the things that have been entrusted to you and passing them on to someone else. Management is about taking people where they want to go and where they thank you for taking them there. It's taking care of good things that are so critically important that if you do your job, you're a hero. Leadership is taking people where they need to go and even say they want to go, but they resist going. Leadership means that oftentimes when you do the very thing they asked you to do, they get mad at you for doing it. And so one of the hard struggles of leadership is having to deal with that sense, that dual reality, that there is something that you've been entrusted into your care, and if you're going to be successful, you may not end up being popular with the very people who asked you to do it. So I often say this, so one of the most important things about management, and I want to be clear about this, I'm not a person who thinks that leadership is somehow better than management. Frankly, some of us are having to be leaders because other people were bad managers, right? Like other people didn't take care of the congregation that was given to them, or the facilities, or the mission, or the theological traditions, or the money. And so because they weren't good stewards, we now have to be leaders. So I always say that when you're hiring a youth leader, what you really want to hire is a good youth manager, right? If you take 10 kids to camp, you got to bring 10 kids home, right? 90% is not an A in that class, right? You got to make sure that you get them all home. For 17 years, I was the pastor of a church in Southern California, and I used to take a group of kids every year to Yosemite National Park, where we would take our rising high school seniors to the top of Half Dome. a bunch of beach kids who would do an 18-mile hike that included right in the middle of it having to use these cables to go up the side of a granite face to get up to this amazing vista, and where we would talk about making decisions that would shape your whole life by starting now. And what's interesting is every year it happened, but this very first year it happened so specifically that by the time you get to the cables, all the kids who are in the best shape, the water polo kids and the cross-country runners and the wrestlers, they're like ready to charge. And the other kids and the adults are wanting to get a breather. And because I'm the pastor, I got to stay behind and make sure everybody gets up. I'm the last one up. And right then, some kid will look at me, and one of the kids, Eric, says to me, "Pastor Todd, could we just go up the cables? We'll wait for you up there. Believe me, it'll be great." And so sure enough, I said yes and let him go unsupervised to the top of Half Dome. When I get there, there's Eric sitting at the top of Half Dome with his feet dangling over the edge, a 3,000-foot drop below him. Just praising Jesus, right, while he's sitting there. I grab him, I pull him back, I look at him and go, "Eric, you don't understand. If you fall, you get to see Jesus and I got to see your mother. That is way, way worse for me," right? Because Eric had been entrusted to my care and I got to make sure he gets home. So we are going to talk a lot about being people who are trustworthy with what's been given to us, so then we can also be leaders. And the struggle of being leaders is very often, even if you do your job well, people are disappointed. And so how do we do that well together? Give you a little context from my own life. Here it is in miniature. You heard some of the resume, but I want you to just fill in the pictures for you a bit. Served for 10 years at Hollywood Presbyterian Church. Started there when I was 23 years old. They brought me onto their staff after I worked for Youth for Christ doing youth evangelism. They asked me to become their college minister, and they said, "Look, we're going to send you to seminary because you're going to run out of those little youth talks you do by Christmas. You better learn how to teach the Bible." And I was grateful because I ran out of them by Thanksgiving. And so I needed every bit of help. They sent me to seminary and they paid for it. And I say that every place I go because I want to give thanks to a community of people who saw me at 23 and invested in me at that time. Because they did, I came out of my master's program with no debt, which meant my wife and I were able to slowly pay for a PhD that I was able to pursue at Fuller. I did a 4-year PhD and I crammed that in 9 years. But it's because we had to go slowly and pay our way through, and eventually I was able to get my PhD, and that became, that dissertation became the book, It Takes a Church to Raise a Christian. It was a book on practical theology, on communal practices of theology built on the doctrine of the Trinity. And it really started my entire life and ministry in spiritual formation and in communal practices of spiritual formation. And then when my kids were little, my son was 3 years old and my daughter was 3 months old, God gave us the desire of our hearts. We wanted a place where we could pastor a church and raise our children. And when they, at San Clemente Presbyterian, called me to be their pastor, I held up my daughter, who was 3 months old, and I said, "You're all invited to her high school graduation." And God gave us that desire, and we were there until she graduated from high school. And about the time she graduated from high school, I got asked by Fuller Seminary to come back to my alma mater, take on a brand new position that they created for me because they knew we were going to go through a massive shift in theological education, and they wanted me to put formation into the middle of the curriculum and talk about the way in which we lead change. And so I joined Mark Labradon's team there about almost 5 years ago now. My work at San Clemente and the work I started doing in our denomination and in our and with doing some executive coaching and consulting led to the book Canoeing the Mountains, and it's why I've been invited to be with all of you here today. This is my family. My son is 25 years old. He's Brooks. He lives in Seattle. He's an environmental studies major who wants to see the ways in which climate change is making an impact on people who are particularly at risk. Wants to see the church to understand the way in which climate change and justice need to go together more and more in a changing world. My daughter Allie is a 21-year-old senior at Gordon College who wants to be a pastor of all things, and is going to probably start working in a church next year and start at Fuller Seminary. My wife is the talented one of the family. She's an artist and an executive coach and a marriage and family therapist. And Our son's in Seattle, our daughter's in Boston, we're in Los Angeles, and we have a group text that just keeps us connected. I spend all my money on plane tickets so that I can see my kids and on cell service. So that's what we do. But that's a bit of who we are. I gave you Ronald Heifetz's definition. Let me give you mine. If you're at all familiar with the book, some of this will be familiar with you. I'm going to try to tee it up with us and kind of extend from there. But it starts this way. Leadership is energizing a community of people toward their own transformation. Notice right there, if you will, my own calling of my own life. Transformation, spiritual formation, and leadership. Leadership is about energizing a community of people toward their own transformation in order to accomplish a shared mission in the face of a changing world. Let me say something here. You're certainly welcome to take any pictures of slides. I'm going to give you all these slides. So I'm going to show you, I'll make it so it'll be easy for you. I'm going to give you a link that you can get all these slides and some other resources. As a matter of fact, I'm going to give you more than that. But one of the things that Fuller has done is given me permission to be able to give out a lot more information and even some of the stuff we're doing at Fuller on my work so that we can just give it to you as a gift. So I'll give you a way to get that later, and you'll also be able to get that through Jason later. So just so that you know that. But you can, whatever you want to take notes, you can do so. But I didn't want you to scribble, because not only do I talk fast, I work my way through the slides kind of fast. So let me tell you about this story about how it starts with me. My life changed when I was asked to come speak in Portland, Maine on my first book. I told you it was about spiritual formation and Christian community, and a group of Methodists in Portland, Maine. So I have this deep gratitude to Methodists. A group of Methodists in Portland, Maine invited me to come and speak at a Christian education conference. It was really about how do we create communal practices of spiritual formation. They asked me to speak on 3 topics: spiritual formation, Christian community, kingdom of God. Those were the 3 topics. They also asked me, as good Methodists are wont to do, to try to see if would I be willing to do one more session that would be maybe a question and answer time for anybody who wants to ask me any questions. I had time before my plane left, so I said sure. 200 or so folks were at the conference. 60 people shows up for this Q&A time. Now, my wife is a therapist, I told you, and what my wife has taught me is that in groups of 60, all the extroverts shine and all the introverts hide, and everybody likes it that way, right? But it means that what you end up with in a Q&A time is an extrovert Q&A. You get all the questions of the people who are willing to stand up and grab the microphone and talk, and that happens a lot. There's nothing wrong with that. But she taught me this thing that on occasion I will do, where basically I said, look, what I need you to do is take 30 seconds, think about if you have a question, maybe even write it down, and we're going to gather them all up. We're going to go around the room and gather up all the questions, and then as a group, we're going to decide where we're going to start, what we're going to talk about. So I gave them 30 seconds, then I said, okay, ready, raise your hand if you got a question, and 60 hands went up. And I was like, oh, okay, well, let's do this fast, right? So I said to the person right around my left, I said, okay, you go first. And I'll never forget, she looked at me and she said, you talked a lot about the way in which your church does short-term mission work and the way in which short-term mission work relates to discipleship. I want to talk about mission and discipleship, how they go together. Check. The next 59 other people, however, all asked virtually the same question. And I just sat there stunned as I listened to it. And the question they asked is, what can we do to keep our churches from dying? Now, this was stunning to me because I hadn't come to talk about evangelism or church growth or church renewal or any of those things. I'd come to talk about the kingdom of God, spiritual formation, and Christian community. That's what I was there to talk about. I was about growing deeper, not growing wider or broader. And yet what I realized at that moment is no matter what the agenda of the conference is, there's another agenda that is going on in the hearts of people. It's the agenda of what wakes them up in the middle of the night, that makes them anxious. This was the Northeast, and it's the least churched area of our country. And this was a group of people who've been on the front edge of so much ministry. I mean, if you've spent any time in the Northeast, you've got these beautiful sanctuaries that go back 200 years, many of them with endowed choirs and endowed facilities, and very few people in the sanctuary. And one person said, what can we do on Sunday morning that can compete with Starbucks and soccer and the Sunday New York Times, right? And so I realized there was this other thing going on that I needed to pay attention to. So come with me from Portland, Maine to Alabama, a little closer to here, where one of my colleagues, who's really close to retiring, I just saw him a few weeks ago when I was speaking in Kentucky. And I remember he and I had this conversation, and we were at the end of a meeting, and I asked him, I said, I spent a lot of time talking to churches about change. How has the church changed in Alabama? And I was expecting him to tell me that it hasn't changed much. And what he said was, and he kind of revealed my bias, he said, Todd, you don't get it. 40 years ago, when I started my ministry in Alabama, we didn't even keep track of church membership, church attendance, or any of those things. We didn't have to. Because 40 years ago in Alabama, if a man skipped church on Sunday, his boss asked him about it work on Monday. And what he was revealing was that there was a time not too long ago where even if not everybody was a Christian, the church had the support of the culture. If your church attendance is supported by the local businesses encouraging people to go to church, guess what it does to church attendance, right? If people's family economic thriving is built on their church attendance, well, what does it do to church attendance? And whether that's in the fact that people go to church because they want to network or be seen or because their boss is there or because it's what you're supposed to do, what's changed dramatically in all places of the world is that expectation isn't there so much. If you ever come visit me at Pasadena, California, where Fuller is, at least for the time being, you're going to find that I have in my office a copy of the Los Angeles Times from December 1963. Somebody saved it because the front page of the LA Times was about the Kennedy assassination and the Warren Commission. They handed it on to me because the back page of the front section of the LA Times had an article on the Hollywood Presbyterian Church in December 1963, where I had served. They thought that I would want to see, because it was an article, because it was then, Hollywood Presbyterian was the biggest Presbyterian church in the country. It had over 9,000 members, and it was notable, and the LA Times wrote about it. It had about 4,000 members when I served there. It has under 1,000 members today. But the reason why I kept that article is because in the corner of the LA Times in December 1963, there's a little box where the LA Times would publish for you a week's worth of daily Bible readings. If you can remember a day when the LA Times or the New York Times or the Washington Post would help you with your morning quiet time, then you can remember when the culture supported Christianity. One of the great advantages of the last few years is that I've traveled literally all over the country, and it's amazing how many small towns I'll go into, and it feels like the same city planner planned it as the one down the street, right? Like you walk in, there's a town square, there's a statue of the most famous dead guy, there's a library, there's a courthouse, and there's the first church of whoever got there first, right? First Lutheran, First Methodist, First Baptist. And all the other first churches, they're all on 2nd Street. Because what everybody knew forever is that the center of society was law, education, and religion. And what everybody just assumed was that religion would be Christian religion, whether anybody was a Christian or not. December 1963, the Billy Graham Crusades were at their height. People needed Jesus in December 1963. But there was a home court advantage to the church, and that you got to participate in a world in which those of us who were in ministry could build buildings and talk about our resumes, and that pastors were invited onto school boards, and that we were seen as upstanding members of the society and the community, and we were respected, and our voice was heard, and the scripture was an authority, and nobody questioned those things, even if they didn't believe. That's the world that we've seen pass away since December 1963. 4 months before I was born. In other words, my lifetime. In my lifetime, we've watched that world basically pass away. Darrell Guter from Princeton Seminary put it this way: if Western societies have become post-Christian mission fields, how can traditional churches become then missionary churches? When the mission field is no longer across seawater, but across the sidewalk, when the mission field is literally in the minds and hearts of the people who won't darken your door because they don't even feel the need for it, when you find yourself spending most of your time trying to find those women at the well that we talked about this morning because they don't stumble into church anymore because mostly when they did, it reminded them that they didn't fit. You find yourself now in a completely different world that requires us to lead in a completely different way. This is a crisis for most churches, and it's also a crisis for seminaries, where I am. In 2010, Fuller Seminary did a survey of our alums. I know most of you are seminary grads, or at least university grads, and so you know this. Whenever you get a survey from your school, who's doing the survey? It's the development office, right? It's the office that's trying to raise money. That survey comes from the people who are trying to raise money for the school. And if you're an alum and you get a survey, know that this is what this is, a little insider information for you. Why? Because every school has a formula about how much money they expect to get from alums. And there's this formula that says that over a certain amount of time, as we get more alums and as they get older and they make more money, they should give us this amount of money. And even Fuller has that, and your seminaries do too, I gotta tell you. And what happened in 2010 is that we looked at our data and realized we weren't getting that much money from our alums. So we hired a high-priced consulting firm that told us you just can't ask them, why aren't you giving us money? So the high-priced consulting firm basically put out a survey, and it asked this question to get it started. It said, how do you feel about Fuller Seminary? And the answer we got back is, we love Fuller Seminary. We're so proud of being from Fuller Seminary. We have great memories of Fuller Seminary. I have a shelf of books in my office with all my professors' books. I get every new book from any professor from Fuller. We love Fuller. Can't wait to come back to Pasadena. Want to get a new t-shirt. Oh, we're in. But why don't you give money? The answer is really simple. Seminary didn't prepare me for this that I'm in today. We love our nostalgic memories of Fuller Seminary, but would I invest in it today? No. Didn't prepare me for what I face today. You see, this is the place where we find ourselves in, is that even our training is out of place. The seminaries continue to train people for a Christendom world. And what I want you to hear today is that if you find yourself struggling as a pastor or a lay leader or a person in the church or in leadership, and you're trying to figure out why you don't feel trained for it, it's because you were trained for that world. One of my good friends has a spiritual director who's a Catholic priest. The priest's brother is a Marine Corps jet fighter pilot. I always try to think about what Thanksgiving was like at their house, right? The priest and the jet fighter pilot. And yet, so very interesting is the jet fighter pilot decided for his birthday to invite the priest onto the Marine Corps base and got permission for him to spend some time in a flight simulator. He got to play around with the flight simulators that let you think that you're in one of those incredible planes that the military has. I mean, some of us are like, that's like the best present we could imagine, right? The priest finishes in the flight simulator. He'd all done exhilarated. And because he's a spiritual director and he's great at asking questions, he looks at the guy who's training him and says, so why are you guys so committed to using flight simulators in your training? And the answer he got back was this: at the moment of crisis, you will not rise to the occasion. You will default to your training. See, at the moment of crisis that you find yourself in, when you're in liminal space, when you're facing a different world, when the world has changed dramatically, what you will do is what you've been trained to do. And so what we're always struggling with is the way in which the world is changing and we haven't been trained for it. So think about this. What are you trained to do in most seminaries? Well, what you're trained to do is preaching, programming, and pastoral care, right? You're trained to like talk longer, you know? I mean, I can preach the paint off a barn, right? It's like if there's a problem, what I think about is a sermon series. We should do that, right? Right? That's a good idea. I mean, I know churches that every year they have a revival week. Like, okay, well, last week we had a revival week. We'll have it again this week. And so we preach the same text, we do it again, and we expect a different result. I mean, one of my friends said, we Presbyterians are so good at talking about stuff, after a while we think we've actually done it, right? Well, and if you're not going to be the preaching pastor, well, then you're the program person, right? And that's where most of us started: youth ministry, children's ministry. Some of us got into this because we were really good at running church programs, and the preaching pastor said, you all do that. Like I have to study the word, you get to do the junior high lock-in all night long. Go ahead, right? And it was when we finally woke up and said, you know what, wait a minute, that person's in bed and gets to talk about the Bible, and I got junior hires that I got to get their Skittles out of their ears. So I think I'm going to go to seminary and become the preaching pastor, right? And when a day comes when we're tired of preaching all the time and we know what we're really great at is being able to, we want to sit and walk with people, we become the pastoral care person. And so if our answer to every problem, and it's not a bad set of tools, but it's the only tools we have, is preaching, programming, and pastoral care. So what if you're in a church where people don't show up to hear you preach? Where they tell you this is the program we need more youth programs. And then they don't bring their youth because they're so busy making sure their youth go to pitching coach practice so they can make varsity so they can get a scholarship, right? Or when they say, well, at least they'll call us when they're in need, and then they're not even in the hospital long enough for you to find them to be able to visit them, right? When the world changes so dramatically, we can't use our gifts, then what do? This is the place where we find ourselves today. And the metaphor that's helped me understand this comes out of this metaphor of Lewis and Clark. And if you've read my book, you're familiar with the metaphor, but if you haven't, I like telling it. So basically, here's the story. Some of you will be very familiar with this. So when the United States of America was a relatively young country, Thomas Jefferson bought, as if you could buy a part of the country, he bought the rights to the western part of the United States from Napoleon, who thought, of course, he had the right to it. So these two guys decide that they're going to say, you get to now have it. $15 million, he buys the rights to the western part of the United States. Why does he buy it? He doesn't want the western United States. What he wants is the water route. What everybody wanted was the water route. The key to economic prosperity in that world was controlling the water. Such is why Spain and England had been in a battle for centuries over the seas. What everybody wanted was the possibility to take the goods of Asia and get them to Europe. And it's easier to take raw materials over water than it is over land. So for the better part of 300 years, what people from Europe had been looking for was a way to get to Asia by water. So when Columbus discovers America, like it wasn't there and nobody was there, like when they discover America, they spent the better part of 100 years just trying to figure out how to get through the darn thing. It took them a long time to figure out that what they had stumbled onto was actually much more important than what they were looking for. But by the time you get to 1805, and you've got this young, vulnerable country, the key here was trying to figure out the water route that would connect the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. A water route that everybody knew was there. That if you could go up from the Gulf of Mexico up the Mississippi River to St. Charles, Missouri, where you could then connect to the Missouri River, you could take the Missouri River like a shortcut across the country, and it would connect, they believed, to the Columbia River on the other side. Ships had gone up from the Pacific side up the Columbia River. What they just hadn't found was the connection. And if anybody could discover that connection, they would claim it. And this is what they were about. The core of discovery was about claiming that water route. Just put it this way, it would be like being Amazon today, right? You have the right to have all the goods and services come through your water route. It was that important. And it was that important to the survival of this young country. So they sent out Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and the Corps of Discovery to discover a water route. For 18 months, they went upstream, paddled their way upstream, across the Missouri River, all the way across. They spend a long winter with the Mandan tribe in North Dakota. They wait for the snows to melt. They start off in the spring, and by the time they get on August 12th, 1805, Meriwether Lewis takes a drink out of a tiny little spring that is right on the border of Montana and Idaho. This spring turns into the entire Missouri River. The water from this spring on the border of Montana and Idaho flows all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. They literally put their feet on each side of the spring, and they exulted that they had conquered the mighty Missouri River. And what he believed is that they would take their canoes out of the river, they would carry them a half a day, And then they would put them in a spring on the other side. And after 18 months of going upstream, they'd now get to go downstream. It's August, they believed they could go as fast as possible. They could float all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They would get there. They would take a selfie and send it back to Thomas Jefferson. They would turn around and they would head back, and maybe they could make it back to spend the winter with the Mandan tribe and be home by the next spring. They were so excited about it because they had discovered this is where it would be. This is where the water would be. All they had to do was just get those canoes over, and after 18 months of going upstream, they'd get to go downstream. And of course, what you know is Meriwether Lewis walked up the side of what is the Lemhi Pass and discovered the Rocky Mountains. 300 miles of mountains. Now, let's be clear about this. This is great. The Mandan tribe, this is their home. They know this area. They're like, oh yeah, there's a river over there, but you gotta go across some mountains. They went, mountains. We're from Kentucky. We're good at mountains. You ever seen the Shenandoah Mountains? Now, they're beautiful, don't get me wrong, but there's a difference between the beautiful rolling hills of the Shenandoahs and the 14,000-foot peaks of the Rockies, right? They had no mental model. When they heard mountains, they thought Shenandoahs, not Rockies. They didn't think 300 miles wide. They didn't think that you'd have 60 miles of snow that would be hip deep. They were water guys, right? I always think about that. One of my friends lives in Denver, Colorado. He said Denver, Colorado is founded by the hardy people who made their way across the Great Plains and through all of the dangers and all of the struggles and all the determination, and looked up and said, right here, we're stopping right here. Good. Great view, right here, right? And this is where so many of our churches are. Imagine what it was like. Meriwether Lewis, like John Logan Allen, who's a geographer, says, this is the moment when the geography of hope gave way to the geography of reality. They believed that the world was exactly the same. They believed that the world in front of them was exactly like the world behind them, that this long, slow, gradual uphill would lead to a long, slow, gradual downhill, that they would literally be able, the same way that they paddled their way to the top, they would coast their way down the backside. They're water guys. They're canoers. How do you canoe over mountains? What do you do when you run out of water? What do you do when what you've been trained to do is navigate rapids and you're facing granite peaks, when the terrain is completely and utterly different? One of my other favorite parts about this is that, if you've done any driving there, you know that it's not like the mountains are hidden, right? For 3 months, they had seen the mountains in the distance. 3 months. Meriwether Lewis wrote in his journal, I refuse to believe that there will be anything but a comfortable passage. 3 months. He was in complete denial. Why? Because the mental model was there's a long, slow, gradual uphill to a long, slow, gradual downhill, that whatever is in front of us is the same as what's behind us. If we've been experts in what's behind us, we'll be experts in what's in front of us. And frankly, if December 1963 ever comes back, we Presbyterians are going to rule. We're going to own it because we were great in December 1963. But what if you find yourself here at this moment, looking at these mountains, and you're a canoeer? You were brought along for this reason because you're good at navigating rapids. You built your own keel boats. You dug your own canoes. You're good on water. And now you're facing mountains. What I want you to know is it doesn't do you any good to paddle harder. It's kind of silly to try harder. No water, but we're going to paddle. I'm determined. Instead, what do you have to do? And this is the place where we find ourselves. We were trained for a totally different context. We were trained for rivers and not for mountains. And what we need is to learn is a new way of leading. And this is where the church finds itself today. Your church might be sitting right in this exact spot. You might be the person looking over the edge, or something has come to you. A person's walked into your congregation. You built a big church and it's mostly empty. You can remember the glory days of a great program when people were just there. People tell you stories and look at you and go, if only you would try harder. Well, then maybe we could have the smooth sailing that we used to do. What's the problem, pastor? What's the problem, leaders? What's the problem, board? And you're there. I always wondered why Meriwether Lewis didn't go, Corps of Discovery. We're supposed to discover a water route. You know what we discovered? Ain't no water. Let's go tell Thomas Jefferson, right? We'll go back, we'll tell him, we'll say, hey, next time send horses, right? Well, I'm kind of surprised. Instead, he said, we proceeded on. Now, one of the men who was also taking notes, who was one of the enlisted men, said, those were the most horrible mountains we ever beheld. Because he probably thought he had to carry his canoe over it, right? What do you do when you're facing mountains and you're a canoer? What some of us do is where we turn our churches into the great historical museum of canoeing. Right? We're going to go back and we're going to show you how good we are at the river. We're going to take people on tours right up to the edge of the mountain. Great view, back to the river, because you know why? Because this is what we're good at. Notice, let me tell you stories about canoers of the past. Look how awesome this is. Watch us do this. And we keep going in circles, not wanting to face what's in front of us. Or some of us just get stuck. We just find ourselves looking at those mountains thinking, why did I have to be born now? Why couldn't I have been a pastor in December 1963? Why am I called to this moment at this time? Let's face it, December 1963 wasn't good for everybody. December 1963 was good mostly for people who look like me. But there's a whole bunch of people who look like me who want to convince you that that's what it's supposed to be. And the world actually in front of us is way different. And I want you to know it's way better if we can learn to drop our canoes and journey on. So here's what I want you to do. I want to give you a couple minutes to talk with each other, just as I want you to have some concrete things in your head. This is going to be better if you're actually thinking of a particular thing. So what I'd like you to do is we won't be able to use the whole table, not at the moment, but just I want you to talk to the person next to you, or maybe two people next to you, maybe twos or threes. I know you're from Mississippi. You're going to want to make sure everybody's hospitable and feels good. We don't have that much time. I'm from California. But what I'd like you to basically do is try to get a real concrete thing in your head. Here's what I'd like you to do. What's one challenge in your church that you just can't get traction on? What's one issue that no matter how hard you work on it just keeps coming back over and over and over again? What's the thing that you've tried lots of different times, you're trying to work on that if we could just solve this one, we'd be good? And I'd like you just basically share that with each other, and I'd like you to just talk about that. I'm going to give you like 6 minutes, okay? So if you want to talk about the whole table, you each get 30 seconds. So ready? Go. 6 minutes or so, and then I'll be back.